This podcast is sponsored by Action Steel.
I'm talking dry sowing because we've got a whole range of new pre-emergent herbicides, mostly from other groups, so group 13 and so on, and group 15, which have completely different properties to what we had 20 years ago. We've actually now got an opportunity where we can use that set of chemistry to deal with our weed, our ryegrass issues, and add to that our crop competition from getting our crop in early in the season. So it's just thinking, I think, about the whole system and saying, instead of trying to make knockdown herbicides work all the time, what is if we replace knockdown herbicides with something that's different?
Hello and welcome back to Shared Ag Solutions by BCG. I'm Janine Batters, and in this episode we're very lucky to be speaking with Professor Chris Preston about summer weed control and some of the things that we need to be thinking about in the lead up to summer and really getting a good kill on these weeds. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Super excited to have you on our podcast, Chris. So for a start, I think probably everybody that's listening to this podcast is going to know who you are. So I'm not going to ask you to introduce yourself. What I thought might be interesting is if you could tell us, how did you get into all of this? What made you decide that you wanted to be one of the leading experts in weeds?
The short version of it is that I've got a training in plant biochemistry. I've got a chemistry degree, and I was working in the US 3 decades ago now, working on biofuels. And eventually one day I decided that nobody really cared about biofuels that much, and I wanted to do something that people cared about. So I looked for other things to do, and I kind of fell into agriculture by accident. But one of the things that I discovered when I started working on herbicide-resistant weeds, which back then was more an academic pursuit than what it is now, was that actually farmers were really interested in finding out ways to farm better. And they were really interested in the sort of research that I was doing that seemed to be perhaps going to give them some insights on how to do that. One of the things about working on weeds is that things change all the time. We've always got to be trying to think creatively about how we're going to tackle these new problems that are coming. And there's already some well and truly on the horizon. I'm sure we're going to talk about on this podcast, but the whole APVMA Paraquat review is getting me to rethink, look, what are we going to do, particularly around the double knock?
Can you give me your thoughts on the APVMA's review on Paraquat and diquat and how you think that will affect farmers?
Well, I think farmers are actually quite a lot worried about the outcome of the review, and they're looking at it, perhaps they're going to completely lose these products. The current proposal from the APVMA suggests that we're going to lose a lot of uses of these products, and we will have reduced rates for most of the uses that are left. Now, this is going to be challenging for farmers. However, what the current proposal is mightn't be what we end up getting handed. So industry has made quite a number of submissions to the APVMA about various aspects of their review. And so we might get a few more use patterns back. We might get some higher rates, but I'm moderately convinced that we won't go back to the rates that we have, and we won't go back to all the use patterns we have. I'm looking forward and going, okay, if we're going to have reduced rates and reduced use patterns, what can we do that's going to fill the spaces that the review is going to lead us in some of our challenging situations? And so one of those is the double knock. We've used the double knock very widely to help us manage glyphosate-resistant weeds. And if we don't have the rates of paraquat that we've been using, are there other things that we can do, for example, with the reduced rate of paraquat we've got, or adding other practices to that? So that might be other herbicides or maybe other things that we can do that will help us get over that problem. I'm finding the thinking and the challenge about the double knock in summer as being harder because there's really fewer options available for us in that space. But nonetheless, I think that we will look at some of those and look to see what the opportunities are. There is a level of urgency about this because a decision will be made probably sometime next year, and then labels will change after that. But it's not something that we have to get done for this coming season. We'll still be able to use Paraquat as the current labels for the time being.
What are some of the recommendations that you think you might be putting forward if the APVMA do make this change?
In the double knock space, sort of things that I've been thinking about is that I've done a couple of years of research where we've been looking essentially at cropping without glyphosate because of, at that time, the potential risk that some of our key markets might ban glyphosate. But I think that whole thinking can be also repurposed to cropping without paraquat. So what we're essentially looking at there is how can we make glufosinate work in that space? And what is the sort of set of practices we might have to get something that'll be effective enough for that knockdown space? So we were looking at glufosinate plus group 14 herbicides. So these are your spike herbicides, things like sharpen and so on. And we were looking at dry seeding as potential options in that space. So instead of having a glufosinate mixture followed up by paraquat, we might have to have a double knock that's glufosinate mixture followed up by glyphosate. Be opportunities for products like amitrol in that space. So there's a herbicide called Gorilla, which is a mix of paraquat plus amitrol. That might have an opportunity in some of that space. But I think it's a thing that we have to explore. We have to explore what are the things that we can do. And then when we work out which ones seem to be effective, then we should look at how's that actually going to work for a farmer.
So what was the one that you said, what was it?
Glufosinate. So this is sold as Liberty for use in canola, but it does have a pre-crop registration in the product BIFO.
So what group is glufosinate?
It's group 10. We
Okay, and
currently
is
don't
it
use
expensive?
very much of it. It's a lot cheaper than it used to be, but when we're talking about comparisons to glyphosate, most of our herbicides are expensive. So this will be more expensive than what we're currently doing, probably not massively so.
Okay, that's good news. And it's good news that you're already thinking about this. Is there any other alternatives that you've been looking into other than chemicals?
Our other alternatives at that time are fairly limited. So, for example, we used to use tillage to control weeds at that period, but one of the things that tillage did was it damaged our soils. It removed the crop residue we had on protecting the soils. It delayed sowing. From most perspectives, tillage is not an attractive option. The sort of new bits of chemistry that are out there, or new bits of non-chemistry, I should say, that are out there that you might be hearing about, things like we've heard about microwaves, for example, and lasers and electrocution of weeds. Most of those, I think, are going to be too slow for that particular purpose. Where we have tried to change things up is to really have a bit of a focus on, can we get all this done with dry sowing? And so we're not actually using knockdown herbicides. And we're going to use instead a combination of our pre-emergent herbicides plus crop competition. So really that focus more around dry sowing, in particular with wheat, compared to, say, some of the other crops. Looking at how do we take advantage of that competitive ability we get from sowing wheat early and using the right set of pre-emergent herbicides to actually fill that space and take the pressure off those knockdown herbicides that we've had. So it's still using chemistry, but it's using chemistry and other practices. So it's not a direct, we're going to replace paraquat with this herbicide. We're actually going to replace paraquat with the system.
And that system is dry sowing.
Dry sowing. And you won't be able to dry sow every year, of course, but this would be an opportunistic approach. I'm talking dry sowing because we've got a whole range of new pre-emergent herbicides, mostly from other groups, so group 13 and so on, and group 15, which have completely different properties to what we had 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, when we were reliant on trifluralin as our pre-emergent herbicide, dry sowing was a thing that people only did when they really had no other choice. With the range of products we have available now, and particularly with our ability to use some of these herbicides as an early post-emergent herbicide in crops. So things like Box of Gold, Sulfocarb, Matino Complete, for example. We've actually now got an opportunity where we can use that set of chemistry to deal with our weed, our ryegrass issues, and add to that our crop competition from getting our crop in early in the season. So it's just thinking, I think, about the whole system and saying, instead of trying to make knockdown herbicides work all the time, what is it if we replace knockdown herbicides with something that's different?
I'm quite a hands-on kind of learner, Chris. Can you talk me through this approach? So I want to sow barley in a paddock next year. Talk me through the system.
The sort of options that you might have in barley might be that you would sow it dry and you might use trifluralin or even trifluralin plus Avadex as your pre-emergent herbicide in a dry seeding system. And then you might, if ryegrass comes through that, you might come back in crop with some Box of Gold, for example, or some Prosulfocarb. Or even if you needed a little bit extra weed control, you could use Matino Complete in that circumstance. So this is about thinking about how do you take advantage of the competition that barley's going to give you. So you only have to have weed control for a few weeks. If you've sown barley early in the season, it's going to end up covering the ground and getting canopy closure quite quickly because the soil's warm.
Okay, so where does glyphosate fit into
Okay, glyphosate comes into this. So if you want to use a more traditional knockdown approach, either you've had rain in early to mid-April, when it's kind of still too early to sow, and you need to get rid of the vegetation that's currently there. So that's where you would go, all right, we're going to need to control some weeds there. We probably don't have enough paraquat for our traditional double knock to work. What are our other alternatives? The problem of using glufosinate in that space is it's got to plant back to sowing your crop of 2 weeks on the label. So if you're going to double knock, you have to put glufosinate in your first knock so you can come back with glyphosate in your second knock. And instead of the traditional double knock we've had where you would use glyphosate and you could come back the next day with paraquat, we're going to have to require a longer space between the two herbicides because glufosinate tends to be a bleacher. It burns the leaves off plants. And if you've got glyphosate sitting on the outside and you burn the leaf off, you're not going to get as much glyphosate taken up. So you need to wait that little bit of extra time until any surviving weeds start to regrow, and then you hit them with the glyphosate component. And I think in thinking about it that way, the kind of unknown question there is that if you're going to put a group 14 herbicide in to help this, which part of that would you put it in? The work we did with glufosinate suggested that probably Veraxor was the best group 14 herbicide to mix with it. That also has a plant back for most crops on the label. And so in that case, you'd probably think of putting the Veraxor in with that first knock. So probably in with the glufosinate component. Now, there are other things that we could do because we still will have paraquat at a lower rate. So, for example, we could decide that instead of putting glyphosate in as that second knock, we could put paraquat plus our group 14 in that second knock, in which case we'd probably want to use maybe something like Terador, where we don't have that plant back problem. So there's lots of options. It's a case of what's going to work depending upon the weed spectrum you have and what you're trying to do.
So you're really talking my language, Chris, when you go into the details of it. Was there any more advice that you would have in the meantime?
I think the glufosinate work is going to be a couple of years till we've got a really good idea of what the best approaches are. So at the moment, we've done a bit of work around without glyphosate, but we now need to do the same thing without paraquat. Essentially, I think we'll have an idea. By the time farmers are probably going to have to really focus on, I can't use the traditional double knock, what am I going to do? We'll probably have some better idea about that. But I think the idea of dry seeding, particularly wheat, but you can dry sow some of your other crops with advantage. It's something farmers can probably do now if we get a dry start to a season. Hopefully they've learned a bit about what are the bits of chemistry that really suit dry sowing compared to the ones that don't. And certainly I've talked a fair bit over the years about which ones we should be focusing on things like peroxysulfone, trifluralin and really suit dry sowing. So if you know you've got a big problem and you're going to go dry sowing, you probably need something in crop as well as that pre-emergent herbicide. So I think this is a practice that farmers can go, yeah, we can take on this now if we get a dry start next year. And then, well, we don't have to worry about what rate of paraquat we're using because we're not using it.
Okay, but if the APVMA rule in the next couple of months, is that likely?
I think it's unlikely that we would have label change by the time of sowing next year. That's my current feeling, because the APVMA's got to review all the material that's been sent to it. If it reviews all the material that's been sent to it and works out really quickly, it doesn't change our decision, then maybe we might see some changes more quickly. But I'm suspecting that what will happen is that they'll look at it and they'll go, oh, yeah, we didn't actually consider that piece of information. We might have to go back and revisit our decision. And if that's the case, then that'll take extra time. So it's one of those kind of hard ones to predict when we're going to see it. I mean, the reason we've been doing this work is to find different approaches to a looming problem for us anyway. I mean, because we're getting a lot of weeds that have got resistance to glyphosate. We have to do something about that knockdown space.
Compliant chemical storage sheds are important infrastructure for cropping enterprises from a safety point of view and for sustainability certification. BCG Gold sponsors Action, the Big Shed People, have developed a range of standard chemical shed designs to help you meet these requirements. Designs include details such as lock-up storage areas, bunded concrete floors, ventilation and sprayer bays. Head to actionsteel.com.au to learn more about the designs, sizes and prices.
Okay, so moving on to summer weed control in general. I think, Chris, we have seen, particularly in this area, probably over towards Adelaide as well, that summer weed control has just played such a big role this year in whether a crop does any good or whether it's really struggling. You can really see the paddocks that have either been on fallow, of course, or have had that good summer knock compared to those that might have missed it. What would your advice be to farmers that they're already probably in harvest or doing hay or about to start harvest to control their summer weeds, keeping in mind they are in harvest, they are really busy, and then they want to go on holidays?
Yeah, it's probably one of our biggest issues is getting summer weed control exactly right. What we do know is we really are now fully understanding the value of moisture saving over the summer period for the next year's crop. One of the parts of planning is, I think, to understand which of your paddocks are you going to put into crop next year. Which ones are you sure you really want to have a crop in? Which ones are you going to rotate into pasture? Because that might change your decision about how you approach summer weeds in those paddocks. I think it's fairly straightforward to say, these are the paddocks I'm going to put into crop next year. They're the ones where I need to retain as much moisture as possible that's fallen over that summer period. And they're the ones to focus on summer weed control. Going into pasture, you can take a much less focused approach to summer weed control in those paddocks. And you might really think about only controlling some specific weeds like heliotrope if they come up in those paddocks. So when we're thinking about summer weed control, a number of the weeds that challenge us over summer have actually already germinated. They were germinating back late August, early September, and they'll be in under the crop canopy. So weeds like fleabane, for example. And where we'll find them will most likely be in the crops we have that have got much less crop competition. So pulses and where cereals have been uncompetitive for whatever reason. So they've been late sown, for example, or you've sown them on really wide rows or whatever's caused them to be uncompetitive. So they're going to be the paddocks where the main planning is going to have to be done. So things that farmers can do is that prior to harvest, they can actually go out and check crops and see, do I have summer weeds already growing there? Is fleabane already germinated? In which case I know I've got to deal with that paddock as a priority after harvest. If the paddocks are relatively clean, then you are going to have a much lower weed burden. It's going to have much less impact on how much moisture it takes, and you can afford to have that as a sort of a second or third priority paddock that you're going to deal with. I think the biggest issue with the problems that we're having around these spring germinating weeds is that the earlier we get on to controlling those weeds, the smaller they are and the easier they are to control. I've got to get harvest off. I spent long days harvesting. I now want to go on holidays for 4 weeks down the beach, and I'm not going to think about anything till I get back. Just allows those weeds to get larger and larger and become more and more difficult to control. If there's the ability to, in between harvest and heading to the beach, to get those high priority paddocks some weed control on them and reduce the weed burden, they're going to be much easier to manage further into the summer fallow period. So part of it's, I think, about sorting paddocks into which ones absolutely need summer weed control, which ones don't have too much in them, so they can afford to wait a little bit. And if I do have to control them, it might be a little bit more difficult, but because they don't have too many weeds, it's not a problem. Ones I can put the sheep in to eat the weeds for a while because they're going to go into pasture, and therefore that summer moisture retention is not going to be quite as valuable. What we also get, as we saw last year, is we can get those really big summer rainfall events. And those really big summer rainfall events will do a couple of things. One, if you've got existing weeds in the paddock, they will really allow those weeds to push on. They're already deep rooted. They're just going to grow into massive great monsters, but it'll germinate a whole bunch of new weeds. So if you're weed free and you get a rainfall event, it just wets up the surface and dries out again, all those surface germinating weeds won't come up. What might happen is you might get things like melons and so on that can be a bit troublesome. They might come up, but you probably end up with a lot lower weed problem than if you get a large rainfall event where the soil remains wet for 3, 4, 5 days, because that'll germinate those summer weeds as well. Those sort of spring germinating summer weeds, so things like fleabane. Often in the south, we don't see a lot of fleabane germinate over summer because we just tend to have these thunderstorms that drop 10, 15 millimetres of rain, and then we'll have a couple of 30-degree days and they dry the surface out. Where we will see them germinate in those circumstances, often in the crop row, where there's a bit of shading and the surface doesn't dry out as fast. So I think there are places to actually go and look after these summer rainfall events to work out what's really happening. So, driving around the paddock and going, I don't see anything, stop, move some of the straw away and just see that you don't have anything germinating where that moisture's been accumulating.
We get a rain after harvest or in harvest, and I often think, that's going to summer weeds. But you're saying that actually rainy for one day and then we get another 5 hot days, it's probably not as big a deal. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, so if we get a sustained period of rainfall in summer, so if you get rain every afternoon for 3 or 4 days, that'll be enough to keep the soil moist, and you might get a large crop of summer weeds occurring all over the paddock. Otherwise, these surface germinating weeds like fleabane are really going to turn up where water is collecting. And that's why, in the summertime, we see a lot of this happening on roadsides. That's because water runs off the roads and collects on the roadside edge. We've got vegetation and other material along there which help shade the surface so it doesn't dry out as fast. So we're looking at those places where the soil doesn't dry out quickly. But I think the big issue we often have is that after harvest, we'll end up with those big weeds. They require a lot of attention. Dealing with those later ones is often a not every year problem, because you don't always get a big rainfall event over summer. You might get a few millimetres here and a few millimetres somewhere else, and it's really not adding up to a whole lot. So you're often trying to protect that first rainfall event you got in time for harvest. The planning component of it is to really make some decisions about which of your paddocks are a must for early summer weed control to reduce the weed burden so they're easier to manage as the season goes on and you have less losses? Which ones can you get away with being not so rigorous around summer weed control on that gives you a bit of flexibility?
I like what you're saying there. You're really breaking it down because it's all very easy to say, but I like that you've actually thought about this in terms of being a farmer because, yeah, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, once you finish harvest, I know you want to go on holidays, but, just get your weeds. But people are exhausted. They're so tired and they need a holiday. So I really like what you're saying about break down your paddocks. Prioritize the ones that are really important, perhaps put some sheep on some other ones, and hopefully you've got someone to look after your sheep while you go on holidays. That's the next problem, but we won't go into that. And then would you also suggest getting a contractor in? Because I'm just thinking, again, all very easy to say, and I know contractors cost money, but it's just so important that farmers get to have a break. It might not be 4 weeks, it might be 1 week. But if they feel like they're tied to the farm and they have to get these summer weeds, which are obviously really important and they need to be killed, and it's going to be cheaper, isn't it, if they get them when they're smaller as well?
It will be cheaper to get them when they're smaller. And I think the idea about getting a contractor in is a good one. If you're a farmer and you're feeling under pressure about, time pressure about getting everything done, yeah, absolutely. Part of the issue that I think farmers have around some of the things that we're doing is that their farms have got too big for the amount of equipment they have. And this creates some real challenges about how to get things done in a timely fashion. And we see that every year where we have a lot of summer rain is that farmers struggle to get across their paddocks to do all their summer weed control. So I think it's understanding what your own limitations are. And I'm just thinking about all the practicalities around this and how to do a good job. It may really make sense that you've got a few paddocks that a contractor needs to do just to make sure that the whole of the farm you need to get done gets done in a timely fashion. That's probably what you should be thinking about doing.
Summer weed, summer life balance, I think. So do you have any calculations on how much money farmers are losing by letting those summer weeds grow?
I think that's probably the most difficult question you can ask, is because a lot of it depends on how much moisture you're going to save in the soil. So how much moisture loss is going to happen. And if you think about it, the old French Schultz model, it said you got 20 kilos of grain for every millimetre of rainfall. Well, we've now shifted that. And part of the reason we've shifted that is, one, we don't get as much evaporation as we used to have. But secondly, we're using stored moisture. And that stored moisture can be worth, depending on how much is there, can be worth, up to a tonne of grain. That's the bit, is that how much do you have to protect is how much you've got to lose. Where we get those big seasons, like some guys had last year, there's some farmers in the Mallee who've virtually grown their crop on stored moisture this year. If you'd lost all that because you didn't get your summer weed control done, then you've lost a significant amount of this year's revenue. We know in the big picture, the average is you get $35 back for every dollar you spend on summer weed control. But that varies widely from almost nothing to hundreds of dollars.
So if you can put that cost in at the start of the year, it might save your whole season. We've spoken about first going out and monitoring your paddock. So if you've perhaps even before harvest, seeing what's there, after harvest, making sure you're moving the stubble around, getting out of the ute and actually seeing what's underneath. Talking about with those summer rainfall events to get out and check after those rainfall events, knowing that if you just get one rain and then 5 hot days, it might actually not do anything. Whereas if something's being sheltered, or you really need to get in and see if the ground's still damp to see whether something's germinating. So prioritising those paddocks, perhaps putting some sheep on, maybe getting a contractor in. And then also you're talking about with the APVMA and the diquat and the Paraquat to just wait and see, obviously, what happens, but knowing that you and your science buddies and people at BCG, we're working on strategies to help farmers, because we know that these things are just going to pop up all the time. And as you say, we have to look at these strategies anyway, because we're seeing resistance. Was there anything else? Did I capture that okay?
No, I think you've caught everything that I've talked about so far. Yes.
Good. Was there anything else, if you had a key message, Chris, for farmers this harvest and post-harvest, what would it be?
I think the key message I would have would be to have a plan. Develop a plan for what you're going to do. And within that, have an idea about some contingencies. So your plan at the moment might be that I've got these paddocks where I'm going to make sure I'm going to get complete summer weed control. I've got these other paddocks which I'm going to have sheep on, so it doesn't really matter. And then if it rains, what will I do? Will I change any of my decisions? And understand how you might change your decisions before that event happens. That if it does happen, you can step into those new decisions, prioritize how you're going to plan, because those paddocks that had more competitive crops in this year are probably going to need less attention than those ones that had less competitive crops.
If you love the podcast and would like to show your support, please rate us 5 stars wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it with your friends. We'll catch you again soon.
BCG drives the prosperity of Australian farmers, communities and landscapes through applied research, innovation and events. To find out more about what we're up to, our team and events near you, visit bcg.org.au. BCG acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present.